Hi everyone, I'm going to present the importance of observing responses on social skill development in children with developmental disabilities. Cohen, Luke, and Greer, 2008, described the importance of the acquisition of observing responses and the reinforcers that support these responses in the environment as they lead to an increased access to the social community for children with disabilities. This is a very important statement, and it made me think of a lot of children I work with, both in the school system and in a clinical setting, that do not yet have observing responses in repertoire. This can lead to a variety of problems, but significantly in aspects to gaining those social skills, as their typically developing peers do. So things that I've noticed, children who do not orient towards the door when a technician or adult walk in. We've also seen children, and you might have experienced this yourself, that don't orient towards loud sounds. So when materials are dropped on the floor, they don't even indicate they hear anything or acknowledge that within the environment by observing. I've also seen extreme cases where children are not even orienting towards flashing lights in case of fire drills. This can be problematic as described, but significantly for this paper, we're going to look at how those observing responses play a part in developing social skills. So the purpose of this paper is going to be to review literature suggesting the importance of observational learning on social skill development in children with disabilities. The information provided is going to touch on context in experimental and applied research, as well as look at the translational research methods and how they bridge the gap between the two. So in the field of education and psychology, the how and why individuals observe certain aspects of the environment has long been a topic of interest for researchers. There are a number of studies which investigate multiple aspects of observing responses in their attempt to explain various behavioral phenomena. Observing responses are critical components of language functions and are associated with foundational skills needed in listener and speaker repertoires. Observing responses are also the foundation and necessary capabilities in building social skill behaviors and engaging in social interactions within their environment. Translational research itself strives for improvement in theory or practice through the synthesis of basic and applied research. So we commonly think of this as bridging the gap between applied and experimental research. And we're going to discuss this in terms of observing responses and how that relates to observational learning as we continue in the presentation. Measure 2010 stated, basic research has produced a wealth of new knowledge about the behavior of individual organisms. The recent growth of the quantity and variety of translational research is a sign that the time is right for tapping into this reservoir of data, theoretical explanations, and concepts, and demonstrating their importance outside the laboratory. By extending basic research on observing responses beyond the laboratory setting, the practical implications of these findings can provide additional support of the importance of translational research in behavior analysis. So observing responses in relation to higher order verbal operands can be described in terms of the foundation observing responses are for verbal operant development. This can then lead to higher order skills, not only in the verbal operants, but in social skill development. So researchers have described observation and observing responses both as critical components in language development. So in order for children to acquire these higher order verbal developmental milestones, as well as participate and contribute to a social community, observing responses should likely be part of a child's behavioral repertoire. Identified as the foundational component to the acquisition of these higher order verbal operants and include the operant responses of looking, listening, tasting, smelling, and touching. Again, in order to access one's environment and the social community, children need to be able to be aware of what's happening around them, and they need those observing responses. Higher order verbal operants are related to the development of social repertoires in children with disabilities. Social functioning is intertwined with language development, whereas one without the other can lead to faulty verbal operands. So before we review the literature, I thought it was important we look at some definitions. So observing responses can be defined as operant responses that are selected by their consequences. These consequences then reinforce observation. Pre-listeners, or children who do not observe in their environment. Pre-listeners do not engage in their environment or participate in their social community, and in turn, they're completely dependent on others. This is important because we do see this a lot with the students and children I work with, that interdependency leads to decreased access to that social community, and it's important that as soon as possible we try to relieve those deficits in order for children to acquire social skills and really be able to participate and engage in their social communities. Observational learning can be defined as the behavior change that occurs through indirect contact of one's environment attributed to observation. There's been a lot of studies on this, such as Greer and Russ 2008 and Greer, Singer, Dudak, and Gocher 2006, in which they described observational learning as a foundational component of children's success as it relates to the acquisition of instructional units through indirect contact. Again, we access a lot of social skills and we view social interactions through observation. So these things are very important and relevant in order to be able to understand how we're going to be able to help kids acquire those skills. Looking at the literature in terms of experimental research, Gaynor and Scholl 2002 studied whether evidence of differential observing could be found with experimental control procedures on non-human subjects. The results indicated observing behaviors were differentiated in a manner suggesting selective observing occurred with regards to the rat's observing behavior. Another study was conducted with human subjects, showed the effects of observing behavior as it relates to restricted stimulus control. Initial eye tracking data showed errors related to failures in observing responses, defined as failures to observe sample stimuli, as well as brief durations of observing by 6 of the 10 participants with intellectual disabilities. The results of this study indicated interventions that control observing response behaviors may not always be sufficient to remedy deficits in restricted stimulus control, but it did call for further development in outside of a laboratory settings. Greer and Singer Dudak 2008 tested whether items such as small plastic discs or strings that were serving as non-reinforcing items for participants would then emerge as reinforcers from conditioning involving an observation intervention. The target participants observed children receiving the items listed above while being denied access to that stimuli. The researchers then tested the effects to see if observing responses would result in the previously non-reinforcing items becoming conditioned reinforcers, as well as in existing repertoires and the acquisition of new repertoires through observation. Prior to the intervention, presenting the disc or string did not function as to reinforce either performance or learning of the new operants. After completing the observational intervention, both items, the string and the disc, did emerge as reinforcers. Looking at some of the literature in applied settings, we can see research by Cohen, Luke, and Greer 2008 on the emergence of observing responses associated with novel social responses were defined as the operant responses that selected out by their consequences. These responses are observed when a child responds as an observer in his environment. The results of this study showed significant changes in the dependent measures investigated with significant gains in observing responses across all participants after the rotated protocol immersion was implemented. So in this example and study, the rotated protocol included things such as conditioning voices and faces, conditioning 2D and 3D stimuli, visual tracking of that stimuli, in order to increase observational and observing responses in their environment. So some of those things we've kind of talked about in the beginning. So they noted that after these procedures, kids were then orienting towards sounds. They were looking at teachers or adults when they were present in the environment, whereas they did not necessarily do that before. Gocher in 2005 used an observational learning protocol with students who were identified by their teachers as behind in terms of their social development as compared to their peers. Now, this is a dissertation study, so there was a lot of results that warranted many benefits. But for the purpose of this paper, I specifically indicated the results in terms of the relevance to social skills. So in his study, the results are significant because the importance of an observational learning protocol was shown in how that related to the development of social skills in children. So upon teaching and inducing observational learning, these kids shown an overall increase in social skill development by observing their peers engage in social interactions. Singer, Dudek, Gocher, and Greer, 2006, focused on distinguishing the effects of observation on emissions of previously acquired repertoires, the acquisition of new repertoires, acquisition of conditioned reinforcers, and the acquisition of observational learning as a repertoire through the observational learning models. The research revealed several types of observational learning models, as well as identifying imitation as a critical component of behavior related to observing responses. Singer, Dudek, Chow, and Loynes, 2013, conducted non-concurrent pre- and post-intervention probes to test the reinforcing effects of the initially neutral stimuli prior to and following the observational intervention in children with autism. So these results indicated that the acquisition of new operants and changes in performance function on the observation emerged following the intervention. These results were significant because it enables the individual to acquire new reinforcers simply by observing others receive those reinforcers, which can be then utilized in other areas such as the development of social skills in children with disabilities. So some significant aspects and why is it important to study and focus on observing responses in relation to social skills development can be seen throughout the DSM. So if any of you are familiar with the DSM, you'll see some of these familiar phrases that I'm going to review. So the American Psychiatric Association classifies social communication and interactions as some of the primary deficit areas used to diagnose children with developmental disorders, and this does include autism spectrum disorder. So you see these similar behaviors appear in regard to the child's social repertoire. So we see things listed such as deficit in eye contact, deficits in use of nonverbal and verbal communication for social purposes, abnormal social approach. I think there's also things in there that state lack of understanding of gestures and those nonverbal cues that we see a lot in social interactions. Again, the primary focus has been on social aspects, so that social communication and social interaction pieces. The common feature in the research review throughout this paper was the importance of observing responses in developing an observational learning repertoire that can be then translated into indirectly learning through observation. Learning through observation allows a child to engage in his environment, and then he can participate in that social community. So in order for a child to acquire new skills incidentally, observational learning must be in repertoire. This is important for children in terms of acquiring social reinforcement through observing responses. Unfortunately, we do see in a lot of cases with kids with developmental disabilities, they lack this much needed repertoire. So unlike the typical developing kids who acquire observing responses very early on in life, children with developmental disabilities sometimes need to be directly taught these things. An outcome goal for all of the kids I service is to increase the functional performance across core deficit areas of social communication, social interaction, and restrictive behaviors. This is important in the social development of all of the kids I see, and that the observational learning behavior is in repertoire, or we can induce this in order for the core deficits to be minimized and in order for them to have success in their social community. So future research ideas can focus on the applied pathway from observational responding and observational learning. So reviewing the applied and experimental research, we can see that there's not necessarily a clear pathway between the two. We see observing responses discussed a lot in experimental research, but we don't necessarily see the path to then how does that relate to observational learning and how that affects the child's foundation of acquiring those social reinforcement in their environment. So it may provide beneficial to collect data on the acquisition of age-appropriate social skill targets through the use of observational interventions with typically and developmentally delayed children. This would require establishing that applied pathway to determine what controls observing responses in one's environment and how that leads to the acquisition of observational learning. So to conclude, the purpose of this paper was to establish the importance of observing responses in the acquisition of observational learning on social skill development in children. We discussed some practical implications for children with developmental disabilities, and why these are such important pieces to make sure they have in place in order to develop those social skills. This serves as a key component of both the goal of translational research and the significance of observing responses as it relates to the significant differences that can be achieved once developed and applied to children. The data described throughout this paper indicated the importance of a foundation of observing behavior and the relation to learning through observation that can be applied to the acquisition of social repertoires. Observing behaviors serve as a key feature in a child's ability to participate in his social community and in gaining levels of independence, which I think is the ultimate goal for a lot of the kids we service. It can still be a problem with kids who are young adults, so I think it's something we need to try to address as early as possible. This was relevant through the research reviewed in this paper and should continue to serve as a platform for continued experimentation and future research. So the next couple of slides, you'll see some references that